Hello everyone, welcome to our session. My name is Chen, and this is my colleague Zibo. The topic we'll talk today is patch Diffing, you are my sword. Deep dive into two critical end-day vulnerabilities in FortiGate. Before we start, let me give a brief introduction to ourselves. We are from Qian, a cybersecurity company based in China. Currently, I primarily focus on IoT and protocol security, and have found multiple vulnerabilities in devices from Synology, Microtik, Ubiquiti, Cisco, and so on. My colleague Zibo, on the other hand, specialized in binary and IoT security. He had reported multiple vulnerabilities to VMware and received acknowledgements for his contribution. We have also presented at conferences like POC, Hack in the Box, Black Hat, ZeroCon before. Here we go now. This talk is broken down into 4 parts. And part 1 will start off by reviewing the critical vulnerabilities impacting FortiGate and Fortinet's progressive file system hardening technique. In part 2, we'll spend some time describing how to perform efficient patch Diffing on FortiGate. In part 3, we'll present our study on 2 critical end-day vulnerabilities in detail. Part 4 is a summary of this talk. Start with the background. Network devices, especially edge devices, have become increasingly attractive targets for attacks in recent years, as shown in this timeline from CIS's long-exploited vulnerability catalog. There are numerous critical vulnerabilities across major vendors, including SonicWall, Palo Alto, Ivanti, Fortinet, Cisco. Many of these CVEs involve authentication bypass or remote code execution vulnerability, the most dangerous vulnerability for edge devices. What's particularly concerning is that many of these vulnerabilities have been observed in active exploitation in the wild, with some being weaponized in ransomware campaigns. This highlights the critical importance of timed patching and security monitoring for these essential network components. Fortinet's product line, especially its FortiGate firewall, is the focus of our talk today. The following are the critical vulnerabilities impacting FortiGate firewall over the past 3 years. These vulnerabilities either lead to authentication bypass or remote code execution. The affected components span across 3 parts: administrative interface, SSO VPN service, and FGFM service. As you might expect, these are precisely the services that are typically exposed to external networks, making them prime target for attackers. Note that CVE-2024-21762 especially affects the FGFM service of FortiManager application, which is used to control FortiGate devices. Compromising the FortiManager would potentially grant the attacker control over all managed FortiGate devices. During our study, we observed that besides patching above vulnerability, Fortinet has progressively implemented several file system hardening techniques across multiple versions, starting with the version 7.0.12, 7.2.5, and 7.4.0, which address the vulnerability CVE-2023-21797. Fortinet introduced a mechanism known as real-time file system integrity checking. This mechanism has 2 main purposes. The first is to prevent unauthorized modification of important binaries. The second is to detect unauthorized binaries and prevent them from running. This security feature is primarily implemented with the kernel level support. Next, we'll examine its implementation from a code perspective to get a general understanding. The first purpose is to prevent unauthorized modification of important binaries. Within the kernel, a function named FortiSecurity Module Editor called Register Security Function. The first parameter of this code includes a structure containing security operations such as 40SM patch lead, 40SM patch relay, 40SM file open. Taking 40SM file open as an example, when a file is opened in write mode, it performs test validation and creates a whitelist blacklist mechanism where All passes matching excluded passes are allowed to be modified. All other passes matching protected passes are protected from modification. The second purpose is to detect unauthorized bytes and prevent them from running. Within the kernel, when a file is mapped into memory, the IMA file unmap function is called the FOS process authorized control probe function, which is responsible for hash validation of executable files. This function calculates the file hash and compares it with the previously stored hash. In general, a hash mismatch will trigger a kernel restart. Interesting, as shown in this code, libav.so and libip.so are explicitly excluded from this validation process, allowing them to be modified without triggering the security mechanism. In version 7.0.13, 7.2.8, and 7.4.1, Fortinet began encrypting root efforts using CHA-20. After all, security through obscurity must be effective. If analysts can't examine it, it must be more secure, right? Better enhancements to file system integrity checking came with 7.0.14, 7.2.8, and 7.4.2. In this version, the system began validating the previously excluded libraries, namely libav.so and libip.so. However, in some versions, the implementation is problematic. When validation failed for this library, the system only displays an alert message instead of triggering a kernel restart. Versions 7.0.16, 7.2.9, 7.4.4, and 7.6.0 implemented a new encryption method for root effort using XOR. Although XOR is a relatively simple encryption technique, Fortinet implemented a complex key declaration process, making the overall encryption more sophisticated than it might initially appear. A significant security milestone was reached with version 7.6.0, which enabled position-independent execution. Note that this method represents only some of the security enhancements we observed during our analysis, not all implemented by Fortinet. Additionally, our analysis primarily focused on the 7-branch versions, though some of these security mechanisms also existed in the 6-branch versions, which are not covered in this presentation. At the end of part 1, we'll share a simplified method we used to jailbreak a recent FortiGate virtual machine. This method involves 2 main steps. The first is to replace libip.so. Specifically, use a tool like Metasploit to generate a custom libip.so, then replace the original file in the VM file system. At the same time, set up a corresponding Metasploit listener to receive incoming connections. The second step is to skip validation via kernel debugging. Using VMware Workstation as an example, we can enable kernel debugging of the guest OS by adding configuration to its VMX file. Once in debug mode, 2 key modifications are needed. First, in function FOS process authorized control function. Upon hitting the first instruction, we jump to the end and set the return value to 0. Second, in function sub 1 to line 660, when the breakpoint is hit, we set byte 7586047 to 0. After implementing both steps, if successful, our replaced libip.so will be loaded by the system. As shown in the screenshot, we successfully received the reverse connection. From here, we can upload additional tools like Zibo and gain a standard root shell. Now that we have a general idea of FortiGate security history and hardening efforts, let's move on to the next part. In part 2, we'll describe our technique for performing efficient patch diffing on FortiGate. Patch Diffing is a well-known technique used to identify changes across versions or binaries related to security patches. For FortiGate devices, patch Diffing can also be used to learn from historical vulnerabilities. However, this process presents a significant challenge. On FortiGate, nearly all programs and configurations are compiled into a single holding monolithic binary /bin/init, which is approximately 70 megabytes in size. As can be seen, all main service binaries are simply symbolic links pointing to this binary. This architecture making patch Diffing particularly challenging, as locating specific components within this massive binary to identify security-relevant changes becomes difficult. Within the init binary, FortiGate implements a dispatch table mechanism to manage its various services. As shown below, the binary contains a mapping table that associates its service limit with the entry point function. When the system invokes the service through its symbolic link, the init process identifies which service is being called and jumps to the appropriate function. This architecture allows FortiGate to maintain a single binary while still providing modular functionality, though it significantly complicates the patch Diffing process. Let's look at a concrete example comparing version 7.14 and 7.13 of FortiGate firmware. As shown below, the total number of functions in init is approximately 215,653, while 215,581 functions are successfully matched between versions. There are 1,961 functions identified as changed. This means we would need to manually analyze at least hundreds of functions to locate specific security-relevant changes, a tremendous time-consuming task. This challenge isn't unique to our research. Other security researchers have encountered similar difficulty when analyzing FortiGate firmware. We can say this is a common pain point. Patch Diffing on FortiGate not easy and time-consuming. Given the challenge posed by FortiGate's monolithic binary structure, we ask ourselves, what if we split it into logical individual components? By breaking down this monolithic structure into logical components like HTTPSD, SWMD, we could focus our patch Diffing efforts only on the specific components relevant to the vulnerability we are investigating, thus making the patch Diffing process significantly more efficient and targeted. So here comes the question: how can we achieve this separation in practice? While FortiGate compiled nearly all programs into a single holding monolithic binary, from a software engineering perspective, the source code must be developed and managed in a modular way. We can make some reasonable assumptions about how components might be organized within the compiled binary. Functions related to a single component are typically closely clustered together. Common functions shared between components are likely located at the beginning or the end of this cluster. General utility functions used across all components probably reside at the very beginning or end of the binary. This assumption provides us with the starting point for attempting to logically separate the components within this massive binary. Based on this assumption about code organization, we can leverage the binary main table in init to identify component boundaries. By sorting the main function addresses of each component from low to high, we can determine the appropriate code range of each component based on the address of its adjacent component's main function. Take the FGFMD component as an example. The FGFMD main function is located at address A1-8DC0 with FDS notify main before it and FIPS test self-test after it. Based on this adjacent main function, we can estimate that the FGFMD component code likely span the address range between its boundaries. With the method for identifying component boundaries established, we can now optimize our patch diffing process. By sorting the functions by sorting functions by address in ascending order within the bin diff result, we can focus our analysis on functions that fall within our target component address range. This approach allows us to filter changes irrelevant to the target component, thus significantly reducing the analysis scope. Let's apply this approach to two real-world examples. The first one is CVE-2024-23113, a format string vulnerability in the FGFMD component. After obtaining the bin diff result between versions 7.0.13 and 7.0.14, we focused our analysis on functions within the FGFMD component address range. As shown in the comparison result, we quickly identified the first one being the vulnerable function. While there are two other similar changes in other functions, our investigation revealed that the first function sub-A 04020 contains a critical vulnerability. This was particularly concerning as it required low authentication and could be easily triggered. Let's look at the specific code changes. The key difference lies in the SSL protocol. The patch adds a %s format specifier to properly handle the string input. Fixing the vulnerability in the original version, where the external controllable value was directly used as the format specifier. The second example is CVE-2024-21762, an out-of-boundaries vulnerability affecting the SSL component. Again, based on the bin diff result between version 7.0.13 and 7.0.14, we focused our analysis on functions within the SSL component address range. Among nearly 60 change functions in this component, we identified sub 1596690 function as the vulnerable function, appearing at the index 14 of the comparison result with a similar score of 0.97. The vulnerable function is SSL AP get client block. Since it's a large function, we will focus on the critical section that contains the vulnerability. In version 7.0.13, the out-of-boundaries vulnerability occurred because variable 28's value is incorrectly obtained from memory location A1 plus 712. Instead of using the return value from SSL get line. The detailed analysis will be covered later. In version 7.0.14, several patches were applied to this function. Two critical fixes are highlighted in the code. A boundary check is added, and most importantly, variable 25 correctly received its value from SSL get line. Now that we have demonstrated how our patch diffing technique helped identify these two vulnerabilities, let's deep dive into the technical details. In the following section, we will analyze both functions and present our research on them. Let's start with CVE-2024-23113. According to Fortinet security advisory, this vulnerability allowed a remote unauthenticated attacker to execute arbitrary code on affected devices. Before diving into the vulnerability in detail, let's understand the role of FGFMD in FortiGate devices. The FortiGate 240 media domain is responsible for communication between FortiGate devices and the Fortinet module. This communication runs over SSL using TCP port 541 for both sending and receiving messages. The FGFM protocol implements a secure communication protocol with the following functions. Now let's examine the protocol formula of FGFM. The protocol message contains four main components: a 4-byte header, where the last byte indicates opcode, The possible values of opcode is 0, 1, and 2. A 4-byte length field calculated as the data length plus line. The data payload, which consists of 3 parts. A method line in the format method parameter terminated by \r\n. Possible method values include reply, keep-alive, getter, put, chill, collect, and accept. 0 or 1 more attribute lines terminated by \r\n, each in the format k equal value. An empty line containing only \r\n. Some examples of method lines and attribute lines are shown in the right side. The file is a 1-byte terminator with a fixed value of 0. It's important to note that this protocol format is based on our reverse engineering analysis and may not be entirely accurate. After having a general understanding of the FGFM protocol, let's analyze how this format string vulnerability occurred. Looking at the code at 7.0.13, in function session read, it first reads data from socket using FGFM socket read, then perform some basic packet validation. In normal cases, if the opcode is 0, FGFM CLT handle function will be called. In FGFM CLT handle function, it first passes the data component by calling FGFM pass message. Based on the passed method field value, the corresponding handle functions will be selected and called from FGFM message handler table. This table contains various message handlers, and in all cases, the FGFM reply message handler will be called. In FGFM reply message handler function, corresponding routines are executed based on the passed data component. In certain cases, this leads to a call to sub-804020 function. In sub-802040 function, as we can see, there is a critical flaw in the SM call. Instead of using a proper format specifier, the function directly uses the value of host IP as the format string. Since the value of host IP is external controllable, this leads to a format string vulnerability that could be exploited by remote attackers. Format string vulnerability is typically straightforward to exploit, and we can leverage this vulnerability to obtain a shield on affected devices. However, developing a workable exploiter typically requires a test device with shield access for debugging and analysis. In general, to exploit it, the key is to identify the correct index of format string on stack. This is where firmware emulation comes into play, as it provides us with the debugging environment we need without requiring physical device access. Firmware emulation is a common technique in embedded security research. The 3 main approaches are followed. Full system emulation using QEMU system mode offers comprehensive system simulation. A user mode emulation using QEMU user mode offers simple setup and direct binary execution. Code fragment emulation using Unicode engine offers high flexibility and custom configuration. While user mode emulation is typically preferred for analyzing safe spirals, it becomes impractical for complex cases like a FortiGate init binary or when analyzing kernel module or bootloader. This leads us to partial emulation, a balanced approach where we focus on specific functional modules or code segments rather than the entire binary. This method is ideal for isolated functions with minimal dependencies and could be implemented using tools like Qian or QEMU user mode with GDB. Looking at the function called Qian and the execution flow of CVE-2024-23113, we can say that the vulnerability exists in the FGFM packet passing and handling process, which is relatively independent. This makes it an ideal candidate for partial emulation. Rather than emulating the entire binary, we can focus on emulating these packet handling functions to analyze and debugging the vulnerability. Let's examine how to implement partial emulation in practice. We'll start with Qian framework. While we ultimately didn't use this approach, understanding this example helps illustrate the partial emulation process. The basic workflow for partial emulation of a normal EF binary using Qian typically involves first calling Q.run to reach the main entry point, which allows the dynamic linker to load and map the EF binary and its required shared language into memories. Setting a hook at main to redirect execution flow to the target function or code segment, while performing required initialization. Adding additional hooks as needed if necessary. While this example provides a clear demonstration of the process, we had to pursue alternative methods for our specific case due to Qian failed to load FortiGate's init binary. Note that Qian's official examples also include a case of U-boot partial emulation, which demonstrates a lot of practical application of this technique. We implemented an alternative approach combining QEMU user mode and GDB, which provides similar partial emulation capabilities with more robust lists. As shown in this example, similar to Qian's example we discussed earlier, we set a breakpoint at main to redirect execute flow to the target function, then perform the required initialization. This approach allows us to achieve similar functionality to Qian, but through GDB debugging interface. As demonstrated in the GDB output, we successfully reached the vulnerable SM call function in our emulated environment. With this approach, we can develop a workable exploit that works not only in emulation, but also on affected real devices. Following is the demo video showing the exploitation of this vulnerability in emulated environment. This video shows we successfully leveraged the vulnerability to obtain a reverse loader gesture. The following is a demo video showing the exploitation on real devices. Notably, the FGF protocol packets used here are exactly the same used as the emulated environment. Thanks. Now let's move into the next and more interesting one, CVE-2024-21762. For this part, I hand over to my colleague Zibo, who will walk you through the technical details of this vulnerability.
CVE-2024-21762 is an OOB write vulnerability affecting the SSVPND component. By leveraging this vulnerability, a remote unauthenticated attacker could achieve arbitrary code execution on affected devices. We identified the vulnerability in the code that handling HTTP trunked data reception. HTTP trunked data usually consists of multiple trunks and ends with a trunk trailer with size 0. As seen in the code, trunk size field decodes to 0 in hex, means the current trunk is the trailer trunk. And next, buffer pointer is updated by adding buffer rate size, and then go to label 50. Next, we see that buffer rate size is used again. This is interesting, because the value can be indirectly controlled. Let's continue tracing it. We observed that \rn is written at the offset of buffer rate size in the buffer pointer without checking whether the write is out of bounds, which is where the vulnerability lies. Even sending a simple packet reveals some anomalies, as shown in the packet in the slides. When we insert a character A into the trailer trunk, after reading the character A, \rn written. However, the write does not occur right after character A, but is offset by 3. And the offset of 3 is exactly the length of the previous line, 0 and CLF. Therefore, the root cause of this vulnerability is the logic error in the code. How to control buffer rate size? It's simple. We increase the trunk size field. Remember, multiple zeros in hex decoding still result in 0. This allows us to perform out of bounds write. For example, by setting the high bytes of the return address on the stack to hex 0A0D, triggering a crash. To exploit this vulnerability, we look for valuable data on the stack. By stack unwinding, we can easily finding the stack space of the parent function and its ancestors. In the stack memory, it not only stores the local variables, return addresses, and the EBP, but also the register used by the parent function's context. When the function returns, it uses pop to restore the parent function's context. One thing that caught my attention was the R13 register. It is a pointer to the heap memory. This is a memory layout diagram. R13 points to heap memory. If we set up the memory layout in front of it, and then use the vulnerability to change the low byte of R13 to hex 0A0D, we might be able to hijack R13 to point to our crafted memory. So what's the value of R13 register? Looking at the parent function's code, we can see that R13 holds the value of variable A1 here. After the function returns, there are multiple branches that involve changed function pointer code. Even the arguments passed to this calls are just A1, which is really interesting. The slide shows 2 of these calls, but setting up multi-level pointers on the heap is not easy. Luckily, PIE is not enabled, so we can take advantage of this ELF structure itself to build second or even third level pointers to eventually point to any function in the GOT table. The libc wrapper for the system function is based on binsh, but in FortiOS, binsh is symlink to binsysctl, which doesn't actually support executing system commands. This reminds me of our old friend, SSL handshake, which has played a big role in many past FortiGate exploits. SSL handshake internally calls the handshake func mentioned in method in the SSL structure. And don't forget, When we hijack it, the SSL structure is already A1. So we can fake a handshake funk and point to any address to take control of our IP. At this point, we have successfully used the vulnerability to hijack our IP. But the key to reliability lies in how effectively we perform the heap 3. By tracing memory allocations, we found that the A1 structure is allocated in the lock SSL connection function, which causes JE calloc to lock a region of size hex 748. The JE malloc heap manager aliens it to hex 800. JE malloc uses bins and runs to manage different sized regions. When there is no free region, the arena locates multiple memory pages and splits them into continuous regions. Since the metadata is separated from the actual data, all 800 sized regions end up being perfectly hex 800 aliened, which is great for our heap 3. Using HTTP post data to build heap 3 primitives is a great choice. It allows us to send large amounts of data and the data gets split. We analyze the parsing logic. First, a value buffer is created to copy the entire parameter. Then a name buffer is created to copy the name part, and the value pointer is set to point to the value part within the buffer. After that, both name and value are URL decoded, and the decoded pair is stored into a map, which involves copying them again. In this whole process, 4 buffers are allocated, but only 1 buffer is actually useful for heap 3. We crafted a special post data format to make heap 3 more effective. Each parameter has an empty name, and the value starts with $00. This causes the parser to allocate just 2 buffers per parameter. A hex 800 buffer used for string and an empty hex 400 buffer. With this setup, the spree covers about 66% of the memory space. Furthermore, we can use larger regions for heap 3, which will further increase the coverage of the spree. Next, we will demonstrate the exploitation of this vulnerability. We are demonstrated with version 7.4.2, where FortiGate has a web mode for SRVPN disabled. By default, even so, the vulnerability can still be successfully exploited. Exploit finished, and obtain a reverse Node.js shell. Thank you. The last part is a simple summary of this talk. To summarize, we first reviewed the FortiGate security landscape focusing on the history of critical ND vulnerabilities and the evolution of file system hardening techniques. Next, we addressed the challenge of analyzing monolithic binaries and introduced an efficient patch diffing approach using logical component splitting for init. We then presented deep dive into 2 vulnerabilities, CVE-2024-23113, where we exploited the FGFM Fortinet string vulnerability via partial emulation, and the CVE-2024-21762, where we leveraged heap feng shui to exploit an OOB write in SRVPND. Overall, this work highlights that specialized techniques are essential for tackling complex embedded targets. Okay, that's all we shared today. We hope you found the session insightful and rewarding. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, so unfortunately we're running out of time, so we don't have a Q&A, but you can always find the speakers in person and ask your question. So thank you, Chen and Zibo for the amazing talk, and let's give them a big applause for their outstanding presentations. Okay, so right now we'll take a coffee break, about like 10 to 15 minutes. And before that, a gentle reminder to please silence your phone, please wear your wristband. You need a wristband to enter the venue. And for those who don't want their photos to be published, remember to get and put on the no media consent sticker at the registration area. And also a reminder that parking passes can be purchased at a flat rate of 15 SGD per entries per day. And finally, there are activities and challenges in the exhibition area. So, go there, have some fun, try the challenge. Maybe you can win the prize. And the next talk will start at 11:25. So don't forget to get back here before that. So go have a drink, take some rest. We'll see you at 11:25. Okay.